You've got to accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, and latch on to the affirmative. Don't mess with Mr. In Between. It's a great song, classic song. And on today's episode of Point of Order, we're going to see if it is good advice when it comes to crafting motions in our meeting. So picture this. You're in a meeting and someone moves the following motion: that the tender for the new pathway not be awarded, and that the operations committee be instructed to investigate other design options and funding partnership opportunities. What we've got here is a motion that has two very distinct directions, let's say. So let's break it down. The first one is that the tender for the new pathway not be awarded. It's proposing that the group, in effect, doesn't do a thing, that the status quo remains. The second part, that the operations committee be instructed to investigate other options and funding partnerships. That's a positive motion. That's saying, if this is adopted, that the operations committee has to go out and do something. So you have in this one motion a negative motion suggesting that the organization does not do a thing, and a positive motion suggesting that the organization does do a thing. We've got both. We've got the negative and we've got the positive. So the question in front of us is, do we have to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative? Latch on to the affirmative. Because in this motion, we're stuck with Mr. In Between. I think what the problem is that this approach can be very confusing. It can be confusing for members. If your organization has staff, it'll end up being confusing for staff. I've seen it in assemblies where members are arguing passionately against, let's say, awarding a tender. They don't think it's a good idea to award a tender in this situation. And the motion is to not award the tender. And at the end of the day, they end up voting against the motion to not award the tender because of the confusing wording that they're dealing with. They're voting against the very thing that they argued to not happen. Even explaining a negative motion, it gets confusing. So the first problem is that this is confusing. The second problem, just talked about. It's confusing enough that members could actually vote the wrong way. They can vote in the exact opposite way in which they thought they were voting. The other problem with proposing negative motions to not do something or to keep the status quo, is that what happens if they fail? The vote on not awarding the tender. Well, what's the decision of the group if the group decides to not award the tender? Of course, they're not going to award the tender, but what now happens, there's still an open question about awarding the tender, right? Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
Okay, at this point, I need to interrupt the video because something wasn't sitting right and it took a while for me to figure out what it was. The issue that I was trying to wrap my head around was the double negative. What happens when the group decides to not do something? Here's what I mean. The question in front of the group was to not award a tender. That motion was defeated. Does that mean that by voting against the motion to not award the tender, that the group actually would like to award the tender? You see, it's confusing as heck, and it is entirely avoidable. What the group could have done instead was to put forward a positive motion to award the tender, and then those who didn't want to award the tender would vote against it. And the result is clear. We will not award the tender in this scenario. Okay, back to your regular scheduled video.
So time for the verdict. Is accentuating the positive a valid point of order? And I think we discovered here that yes, that point of order is well taken. And it's not just me making this argument. Let me read a couple of notes from Robert's rules. So we're going to start with the reaffirmation piece. Motions to reaffirm a position previously taken by adopting a motion or resolution are not in order. Such a motion serves no useful purpose because the original motion is still in effect. Also, possible attempts to amend a motion to reaffirm would come into conflict with the rules for the motion to amend something previously adopted. And if such a motion to reaffirm failed, it would create an ambiguous situation. The second piece is on avoiding a motion containing a negative statement. It is preferable to avoid a motion containing a negative statement, even in cases where the effect of the motion is to propose that something is to be done, since members may become confused as to the effect of voting for or against such a motion. So these really back up the problems that we listed a few minutes earlier. So if we're not proposing negative motions, if we're going to latch on to the affirmative, do this instead. Take the advice of the old song, eliminate the negative, latch on to the affirmative. Craft motions that propose to do something. Avoid motions that propose to keep the status quo. And try to remove unnecessary parts of a motion. That earlier motion that had the two very different statements in it, one positive, one negative, could that have been two separate motions? Sure could.
Meeting adjourned. Now why not check out one of these two videos, and I'll see you next time.
I think it just ended.